I'm James Albury, and today is Saturday the 29th of October 2011. We have with us today a gentleman by the name of Clive. Hello, Clive.
Hi James, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Would you mind telling us why you're here today?
I have been terminally depressed for the last 10 years. I've watched the way the world has developed, both financially, in terms of conflict, and I'd more or less resigned myself to the fact that we couldn't change anything. The movement that started on the 17th of September in Wall Street, prompted by the marches in Spain, the Arab Spring, etc., has actually given me hope. And having come down to the Occupy movement on the first night, I'm filled with optimism that we can change the world. But we need to educate a lot of people.
Well, it's no secret that I share your optimism, Clive. I understand that you're going to be giving a little talk for everybody today. Could you tell us what the nature of that is going to be?
The workshop is called Banking and Finance, and I'm going to explore the actual mechanics of our monetary system and why, on the one hand, it facilitates a migration of all the money to those that have it away from those that don't have enough, and why it creates all sorts of other problems in the world, such as perpetual conflict, the extraction of resources at an exponential rate, and enslaving most of us in debt ultimately. And I won't give the lecture here, so I won't go further.
No, sure, no need to go any further with that. Just one last final question. Without going into too much detail, what makes you feel that you're qualified to talk with knowledge on such a subject?
I've worked in and around the investment management industry and securities industry for some 30 years. I've also done a number of other things. I've been quite involved in the free software movement. And I take an interest in what goes on in the world, and I try to join the dots. We live in a world where it's very difficult to join all the dots, but when you join the dots, a pattern emerges, and it's a pattern that is going to result in collapse, and I think we can avoid it if we can come up with an alternative monetary system.
I'm minded to agree. Well, okay, I look very much forward to your talk, and that will be on my next video.
That we live within, to actually pervert truth. And that got me digging deeper and deeper, and I started looking at banking, and I was shocked to find that I worked in an industry that didn't really understand that the current monetary system is not sustainable, and that's what this talk is about. And I'm also going to talk about what the alternatives might look like and what the benefits of that might be. So we're going to start with fractional reserve banking, and I'm going to use fairly simplified examples, but currently, now we'll go back a bit. When banking started, it was effectively two businesses. The first businesses were places where you could store your gold for safekeeping, and that cost you money. And what the bank would do is issue a note of a promise to redeem your gold whenever you presented that piece of paper. Over time, those pieces of paper became of value in themselves, or perceived value, because people could exchange them between them. And that became the substitute for gold. Now, what the bankers quickly discovered was that not many people actually came back to actually look at their gold or take it out. Which brings us on to our second business. The second business is actually lending money. And originally the moneylenders lent their own gold. They had their own gold, they were typically merchants who'd accumulated gold, and they would lend it for ventures such as exploration across the globe or whatever it may be. And what they also discovered was that because people weren't taking their gold out, they could lend other people's money. So they started lending other people's money. And then they discovered that even when they did that, they could lend other people's money several times over, and still the system would continue. Now, occasionally, people would get rumours that there was no gold in the bank, or insufficient gold in the bank, and they would go running to the bank to withdraw their gold, and that would cause a bank run, and that particular bank would collapse. And that, to some extent, was self-policing. and I can't remember the date, but there was an English law case which actually legalised this form of fraudulent behaviour. And essentially what it did was legalise the process of taking somebody's money and lending it out to someone else. There was an arrangement whereby if you lent them money, you deposited money, you would get some interest, but the concept was established in law. And that was probably a key decision that brought us to where we are today. So the way it operates today, we no longer have a gold standard, we have fiat currency, which is created by the Bank of England on behalf of the government. And I'm not talking about the money, the coins in your pockets that is created in that way. That clearly is finite and is only expanded if they print more. And when they talk about printing money for quantitative easing, that is something totally different. What I'm talking about is money as debt. And if you've not seen the film, you can Google for it, it's called Money as Debt. It explains what I'm talking about very clearly, very simply, so that most people can understand it. So when you go, let's say you've had a bumper year and you want to go and buy a brand new Ferrari, because you expect to make a lot of money in the year coming, and you go to your bank and you say, I'd like to borrow £100,000 to buy my Ferrari, and the bank issues a loan agreement. The mere act of you putting your signature on that loan agreement creates £100,000 worth of money debt. That money didn't exist before, and suddenly it exists. You then take your £100,000 loan and you pay it to your friendly Ferrari dealer, and he deposits it in his bank. And the mechanics of this process are that when it goes into the second bank, and this is a closed banking system, there is something called a fractional reserve factor, which reduces that down by approximately to 1/10 of its original value. And then the bank can again lend 10 times that amount of money to somebody else. The theoretical maximum of one value, starting value, the theoretical value of how many times it can be leveraged out is 90 times. So when the Bank of England talks about putting an extra 75 billion in quantitative easing, added to the 200 billion that was there in 2009, means that theoretically there is 90 times 275 billion sloshing about the economy once it all washes through. Now what that means, and I'm moving on to the role of the central banks, is that central banks have the power to inflate the money supply. And irrespective of short-term fluctuations, it's a very simple concept. If you have goods of a finite quantity and they have a price, let's say I have a basket of goods and they're £1 each, and the money supply is static, and so people come along to me with their money and they pay £1 and they take a banana or a camera or whatever it may be. If we double the money supply, it means that there is more money than there are goods, and it has the effect of doubling the price of the goods. Now it doesn't happen straight away, so it affects different people at different times. So the people who are at the top of the tree and at the front of the queue can actually buy the goods whilst they're still cheap, because people don't realise that the prices are going up. But it's the people further down the chain, usually the poor, who actually end up paying twice what they would have paid had there been no creation of money. So what we have in our current global banking system is legalised fraud in the form of fractional reserve banking, and theft in the form of central banks inflating the money supply. Now the fact that they're both legal is irrelevant to this discussion, because we're talking about a system that is broken. Now the effect of this monetary system has many adverse consequences, and to a great extent that is what has prompted the Occupy movements across the world. Excuse me, I get very dry, so I'm going to take a gulp of water. So let's just examine the effect economically. What the monetary system underpins is an economic system whose survival depends on growth. Now, most economists that work in this square mile would reckon that a 3% rate of economic growth is sustainable and desirable. Now, hands up those who think that 3% growth is a straight line like this. Excellent. Because 3% is a compound rate. It's 3% on last year, and next year's 3% is 3% on this year. And that is an exponential curve. That way. And this debt, and this EU bailout that is being talked about, and the TARP relief programme, and the fiscal stimulus, and any form of debt that is being created to address any problem is adding to this exponential growth. And it is simply unsustainable. There are various types of growth, and we're going to talk a bit about alternative monetary systems a bit later. But if you think about growth in nature, it is typically rapid growth at the beginning. When a child is born, it grows and develops very rapidly. I've just become a grandfather this year, and I'm watching this as it happens. And they grow amazingly quickly. And they get to about age 20 and they start to level off in terms of their physical growth. But then they grow qualitatively. They gain intellect, wisdom, perspective, experience, and that is qualitative growth. And that is what happens universally in the natural world. There are, however, in the natural world, things that grow exponentially, usually disease. And one particular disease is cancer, and that has an exponential growth rate. It starts from a very low base, goes very gradually, and then it gradually starts to take hold. And as it takes hold, it accelerates. And it gets to the stage where it becomes uncurable, and once the host, be it a human being, animal, or any other form of life, it will kill it. My submission to you is that our monetary system is the cancer within the heart of our civilization. And if we could change that and move to a natural growth monetary system, there would be many benefits to accrue from that. Before I move on to what alternatives might look like, I want to just talk a bit about capitalism. The Occupy movement, and I've been involved since the first night, not closely involved, but I've tried to get down here as much as I can and down to St Paul's. And that big banner that was up in front of St Paul's, "Capitalism is Crisis," gave the media the perfect opportunity to characterise this movement as the usual left-wing complainants that they can dismiss, ignore, and take no notice of. We do not live in a capitalist society, a free market capitalist society. I'm not going to debate at the moment the merits of capitalism versus socialism, because I think it's all about dispersal of power, which is what this body represents, and it's personification of the distribution of power. So when people talk about anti-capitalism, they're talking about something that doesn't exist as we know it. What we have is an oligarchic, centrally planned kleptocracy, and it's structured that way. And never mind who the culprits are, the individuals, because this thing is bigger than the individuals.
It's falling apart though.
I'm coming on to that. It's the system itself which is at fault, and that should be the focus of our anger. Now, some of the consequences and some of the causes that have brought people together are many and varied. Many people are anti-war. This monetary system underpins the military-industrial complex. It finances the military-industrial complex, and if there were no underpinning from finance, the military-industrial complex wouldn't need perpetual war. As it is, this exponential growth demands perpetual accelerating war, and that is what we've seen over the last 10 years. The peace dividend from the Cold War would have been very inconvenient for the people at the top, and they've created a whole new excuse for war. The other consequence of this cancerous structure is that it depends on an economic growth rate which is going through the roof, and that demands feeding that growth rate by extracting ever more resources from the ground, cutting down ever more trees, and I don't need to tell anyone around here that that is unsustainable. A more natural monetary system could create a sustainable environment. And finally, no talk on the ills of the system would be complete without its corrupting influence. It corrupts our media. If you know anything about what's been going on at St Paul's over the last 3 weeks, you will know that the media has consistently mischaracterised everything the occupation has done. It has certainly mischaracterised the negotiations with St Paul's. In the early days, I rang the Bishop of London's office to get a meeting to try and avoid any difficulties and try and negotiate solutions around alternative venues. I also a number of us tried to get a meeting with the Dean. Through the Clerk of Works that we'd met, it was agreed that he would meet us, but he never did. The first thing we knew was that letter. So we know that the media does not report the truth. We know our public institutions are corrupt, as evidenced by what's been happening with the Corporation of London. And I'm sure everybody has their own examples. And we know for sure it corrupts our politics. So the solution does not lie with the people who currently represent the establishment. The solution lies with the 99%. But we have a big job ahead of us. The 99% need to understand the nature of this cancerous system that underpins the whole rotten edifice of war, overconsumption, over-extraction of resources, corruption of public officials, and I could give you legion examples of all those, but we haven't got time, and I'm going to hand out some information afterwards which will lead you to various bits of information that I've discovered. I'm in a learning phase still. I've discovered most of what's wrong. It's trying to learn about what the alternatives might be, and I bought 20 copies of a paper along, which is a paper by a lady named Margaret Kennedy, who is a German academic. I assume she's still alive. She wrote this paper in 1995, and it's only an extract that I've printed out, but it shows in numerical terms, mathematical terms, why the system is unsustainable. And it's based on data from Germany before 1995. Now, you'll just have to take my word for it that the German economic system has... What does that mean? It means that there will need to be an abrupt and massive redistribution of wealth and assets. Now, the last time that happened on any scale was in 1917 in Russia. And we know the consequences of that. And the victims weren't just Tsar Nicholas and his family. There were many of the bourgeoisie identified with the old system. In 1792, the French Revolution was even bloodier. And more people went to the guillotine than were beneficiaries of the system that existed prior to that. Basically, anyone who was on suspicion of being tainted was rolled off to the guillotine by the mobs. And that is the prospect that we face on a global scale unless we come up with an alternative. Now, the 1%, because they think in some senses very long term, because they're protecting their dynasties for future generations. They take a very short term view day to day, and they think accumulating more and more and more is in their interests. But if the collapse comes, they will suddenly realise, particularly when their bodyguards, their soldiers and their policemen are similarly afflicted, along with all their families, that they may not have the protection they enjoy today. And so this is a vital lesson for everybody. It doesn't just affect the 99%, it affects everyone. And what Margaret Kennedy proposes in her paper, and as I say, I'm starting out on this process of learning, and I'm sure there are things that need to be looked at, examined. We need to have a full dialogue looking at many different proposals. This is merely one. It's not the first I've looked at, but it's one of the, it certainly spoke in volumes to me. I think we all need to educate ourselves. We cannot rely, we've seen the nature of leadership, that it gets corrupted. If you want to get ahead as an MP, you have to climb the greasy pole, which means you can't tell the truth. I did this workshop last Friday at St Paul's, and a few passers-by came by, and there was a lady, look, middle-aged, middle class, and I don't like to pigeonhole people, but for reference I use that term. And she said to me, she said, I listened to John Humphreys and these so-called economic experts on Radio 4. Why are they not telling us this stuff? Why aren't we hearing from people like you? And I think we all know the answer to that. And don't be seduced by the media. I've given interviews to the Telegraph, the Times, Sky News. I tried to get an interview with Channel 4, but they didn't understand. You will not see any of that material, because I was speaking the truth of the mathematical flaw in our system, and you won't see it. So we have to spread the word ourselves with whatever means we have. I've got some leaflets which will give you links to information, and it's really up to us to take responsibility, educate ourselves, and then understand that the global monetary debt-based system is the key to everything. If we don't change the monetary system, nothing will change, except that it's going to collapse, and then everything will change, and we will all be victims of that change. No good came out of the Russian Revolution for 70 years, or very little good came out of the Russian Revolution for 70 years. So all I implore people is think for yourself, join up the dots, don't rely on one source of information. What I've told you today could be utter bullshit. Go and check, verify. Don't be sidetracked into subsidiary issues that are consequences of this monetary system. If the 99% unify behind this concept that we need a new monetary system and a new political system, change is inevitable and certainly desirable. Thank you for your time. Questions if you have any. Yeah.
Let's hope it's not the case, but if Occupy London and the other Occupy protests around the world are no longer in the public eye in a year's time, let's say, what institutions or publications would you recommend that we keep in touch with?
I can only speak from personal experience, and on my website I try to put links to information. One of the best, but not ideal, it has its own flaws, one of the best news programs I've come across from a global perspective, and let's face it, we live under American hegemony, is an American station called democracynow.org. It's a daily hours news program. A lot of the stuff I disagree with, but they did a program on the 11th of October on the Wall Street occupation that was a whole hour that actually let you see what people were saying on the ground. It wasn't interpreted through the media's usual sort of funnel of truth, as it were, or distortion, should we say. So that's a good source. There is an excellent source of information from a Canadian site called Global Research, and it's globalresearch.ca. It has a decidedly left-wing bias, which I find undermines some of its validity, but what they tell is the truth. They'll tell you the truth about the invasion of Libya. Let me tell you a story about Libya. In 2009, John McCain, of bomb Iran fame, US Senator, and a number of his colleagues were in Libya in 2009, cozying up to Gaddafi. And he was promising Gaddafi that Congress would vote through the necessary powers to supply weapons to Colonel Gaddafi to put down an Al-Qaeda uprising in Benghazi. I kid you not. 2 years later, the excuse for the NATO's obliteration of civilians and infrastructure in Libya was humanitarian causes to protect the citizens of Benghazi. Now, if you join the dots, form your own conclusions. So global research is well worth looking at.
What's your website address?
It's on the piece of paper that I will hand out. If you can pass it around, it's at the bottom.
2 years ago, 400 special service Iraqis came to this country.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Libyan.
SAS,
Yeah.
military trained.
Yeah, sorry.
Can I recommend a news channel, number 85, Russia Today?
Yeah, I watched Russia Today. But remember that Russia Today also has its own agenda, so you have to be selective about, you know, Russia is an aspiring superpower, or it's aspiring to regain its superpower status.
Max Kaiser, he's American, he used to work on Wall Street.
Yeah, I know, I like Max Kaiser's stuff, but even he doesn't talk about all this stuff in great detail.
No,
and he doesn't say, he talks about regulating banks.
Yeah.
Regulating banks does not work.
It's not the answer.
The federal...
It's for Tobin tax, isn't it? It's not the answer.
No, it's not the answer. We cannot treat with the establishment that exists. They will subvert the movement, corrupt it, and we'll be back where we started. We have to change this monetary system. Talking about regulation, let's talk about the subprime crisis. I've been in this industry, as I said earlier, 30 odd years. When I first came in, it was a sort of bit of a club, the finance industry, and I was member of a self-regulating organisation. And basically, it policed itself. If somebody got out of hand, generally people around them would hear and they would be closed down. The Bank of England would call them in for a friendly chat and say, look, this is not on. Yes, it was corrupt, and yes, people made money through insider trading and a few other things. But basically, it didn't threaten our civilization. Although it had all the characteristics I've been talking about, it wasn't as bad as it is today. When they had the Big Bang in 1986, a whole new raft of regulation was brought in. And not 10 years later, Nick Leeson demolished Barings Bank for £800 million. In 2008, Laurent Kerviel managed to take SocGen for $4.5 billion. Now, in between that, there have been a whole new raft of regulation. Didn't stop Laurent Kerviel. Then we come to the subprime crisis. Nobody knows yet what that has cost. Conservative estimates reckon $2 trillion, and we've got more regulation than we've ever had. But the Federal Reserve, the Federal Reserve Bank of America is actually owned by the banks themselves. The Federal Reserve Bank of America is responsible for regulating the banks. Go figure. In the subprime crisis, there was a whole chain of interests and incentives to hide the truth. So we'll take it from the bottom up. What the subprime mortgages were about were loans, low start loans, that started off very cheaply, that enabled the very poor to buy a house they could never have imagined was achievable.
Fannie Mae was a mortgage company.
Yeah, that's a slightly subsidiary issue. I'll come back to that. So they could get a house that they would never have been able to afford had they had to pay for a proper mortgage. There were also speculators who were taking out these low start mortgages to buy a house in a housing market that was going like the clappers. So they had every incentive to keep going and not tell anyone that, you know, this whole thing was rotten, even if they understood it was rotten. You then had the lenders who were issuing these loans to these people who were fraudulently completing their application forms to speculate in the property market, as well as these very poor people who would eventually be victims of this scam when they were dispossessed. And the lenders could actually make their loans, parcel them off to one of the big banks, and then do the same thing all over again. So they weren't about to say, hang on, this is not right, it's not going to work.
The FBI told the American government, they investigated it, told them it was happening, and they just put it in a drawer.
Nobody had an incentive to actually expose this. We then had the ratings agencies, who were a key part of the crisis. Because up until the 1970s, credit rating agencies worked for investors. If I was an investor and I wanted to buy a government bond, I would go to Standard & Poor's and say, will you rate this security for me? And I would pay him a fee. So he was doing me a service and acting in my interests. In the 1970s, the credit rating agencies started charging the issuing banks, thereby aligning the issuing bank's interests with the credit rating agencies. And the investors became a bit of a sideline, really. So that happened in the 1970s, and it laid the foundations for what was later to follow. And if you look back, if you investigate the subprime crisis, there is ample evidence of collusion between the credit rating agencies and the issuing banks to give or achieve AAA ratings for what was toxic junk in investment terms. Now AAA is prime cast iron government debt, and because it has a AAA rating, it has a low rate of interest. These securities were produced with the AAA rating, but with a much higher level of interest. So all the clients who were investing in these pieces of shit, for want of a better word, were getting a much higher rate of interest. They weren't about to question the rationale of the whole fiasco. And so what we have, and the issuing banks, let's talk about the issuing banks, the Goldman Sachs of this world. They were making money from creating the securities. They were making money from trading, buying and selling these securities. They were selling them to their own clients and charging their clients accordingly. And to cap it all, they were betting against their clients that the value would go down. There are criminal acts all the way through the subprime crisis. What have we seen in terms of regulatory response? Are the credit ratings agencies paid by clients? No, they are still paid by institutions. Has anybody of significance, either an organisation or an individual, been held to account for what went on? No. Has anything changed? No. There is another crisis brewing. You may have heard the term credit default swap. A credit default swap is an insurance policy that your loan is not going to go bad. And these credit default swaps are agreed between banks. So Bank A will go to Bank B and say, will you insure my loans? And Bank B says, yeah, sure. So he insures, and then Bank B says, well, I've got all these exposures to loans, I'll go insure with someone else. So everybody's insuring in a big circle. This is very similar to what happened with AIG, and if I forget, remind me to tell you a bit about AIG. In 2006, the value of the credit default swap market was $20 trillion, according to the Bank of International Settlements. That was a threefold increase from 6 trillion 2 years earlier. Here we are 5 years later, and because these credit default swaps are agreed between banks, they don't appear on any exchange, actually quantifying the current value of the market is very difficult. And I haven't actually tried very hard, but I haven't seen any recent figures. But you can reckon it's a lot bigger than 20 trillion. Remember our exponential curve going to the moon. I mentioned AIG. AIG was was insuring banks for their losses on loans, these subprime loans. And when the crisis hit in 2008, Congress was frightened into agreeing the TARP relief program, which was the bailout of the banks. What many people don't know is that there was an emergency meeting over a weekend, I think it was in September, where there was an agreement to bail out AIG. Because if AIG received nearly $13 billion of the bailout of AIG, and in the following quarter they paid out, I can't remember the exact figure, but it was between $4 and $5 billion in bankers' bonuses to themselves. Now you tell me that regulation will work. Sorry, next question. I rather went on that one.
Has anyone heard of a new financial economic system that's been put into place as soon as all the Illuminati have been arrested promoting their New World Order?
Has anyone? Well, there have been a number of experiments over the years, and the paper that is available. In fact,
no, it's actually now in place until all the Illuminati have been arrested. People will get to hear about it.
Would you like to pass those around?
And the guy that's promoting it is Benjamin Fulford, who belongs to the Chinese Dragon Society. Not Chinese, but that's the title. And he's getting help from other sources. Because I keep getting emails about it. A new financial system in place.
What's his name?
Benjamin Fulford. He's fighting the Illuminati. Promote the New World. I saw a sign.
Can I just say something about individuals and attack? What I was saying earlier is that there are a lot of individuals, organisations that are identified as being the culprits of our ills, and they may well be. I'm not disputing any of the stories about the Bilderberg Group and others who have this cosy club to form a one world government. I'm not disputing that. It may or may not be true. What I'm saying is that if you try to use that as the platform to fight the system, you will fail. We will fail. And the reason we will fail is that there's a lot of cynicism out there, and they'll say, oh, it's the usual conspiracy theorists. We have to confront them with truth, and you cannot argue with mathematics, and that's what that paper is. It's mathematically impossible for this system to survive. It's a mathematical impossibility. Once you start identifying organisations, individuals, you then will split support, and we will change nothing. We have to change the system. Not that I'm disputing anything you've said.
This system doesn't have interest.
Yeah.
That's no interest. Plus, he's getting help from ET. You can laugh at that if you want.
From who?
ET. Good ET. Whereas the Illuminati are dealing with bad ET.
Right.
They're gods that they worship, like a place like Bohemian Grove and that, you know, where they sacrifice missing children. And I know that you might laugh at that, but it does play a part.
That may well do. I would implore you to focus on the mechanics.
I am.
Rather than the mythology, but the sort of.
I don't need to.
David Icke.
Yeah, I mean, David Icke speaks
I
a lot
went
of
to the Bank of England one day.
But because he talks about secret organisations, people write him off as a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah,
Forget who's behind it. It's the system that's at fault. If we attack the system, if we attack individuals, they'd be replaced. I still have this question in my mind: why was Dominic Strauss-Kahn a threat? Because people in powerful places can get away with all sorts of shit, and yet he was brought down very abruptly. I just asked the question. I don't know. I merely question everything, because nothing is ever as it seems. But if someone has the inside track on that, I'd be interested.
Well, the IMF are bankrupt anyway.
Well, yeah.
I think this lady was waiting, yeah.
Sorry?
I just wanted to say that my impression, not all of the media have been unhelpful. I felt that having Davis was a bit of a help, because he started off in the way that perhaps wasn't helpful, but he quickly turned the interview that I was listening to when he interviewed 3 top-ranking bankers and business people. He turned it round to ask some very penetrating questions, which were unusual for that programme. So I think he is trying to do his bit in the way that he can do it. Limited, but he's trying to help.
Yeah, and I think Radio 4 today was a lot more critical of St Paul's than they have been hitherto. Individuals within the media, within government, and within our public institutions, there are many individuals who are honourable. I'm not saying they're all corrupt, by no means. But the hierarchy is such that all dissent is suppressed, and you see it all the time. So anybody who steps out of line tends to be marginalised, ridiculed, and eccentric. One of the reasons that the media say they won't print my interview is because I won't give them my name in full. And there's a very good reason for that. We live in a society where the messenger is more important than the message. And all I'm seeking to do is share the knowledge that I have. I'm not a leader of this movement. I'm just trying to help people understand what I've learned over the last few years, or many years, I suppose. Sorry.
What is your background? I was here, but maybe you said it already, but what is your background?
I'll tell you the jobs I've done. That's probably the easiest way.
Yeah.
I left school, went into insurance. I got involved with a computer quotation service fairly early on. I then got sacked from that, and I won't go into that. I then went working on building sites. I then set up my own furniture. I then set up my own furniture business. I then sold that because my partner ran off with most of the money. I then drove a minicab for 4 years. And I then got back into the world of finance and investment management, where I worked until 1994, both running my own company and running a large organisation that most people would recognise. Not the whole organisation, but the investment management bit. And I've also been involved in a software business, and I currently still work in financial services, but I neither invest money nor do I operate a bank. So,
and could I suggest to you the way could I suggest the way you've spoken today, political career, rather
not
than
within this political system.
No, well, it takes someone to change
politics. We
it's
need
like
a new politics.
It's like a religion.
What is?
Not everyone grew up a Muslim, or not everyone grew up a Jew or Christian. Change.
Sometimes when you try a political way, and then you've tried it, but it doesn't work, so you've got to find alternative ways.
What this movement is about,
you start off
I believe,
no man
is
can
building
build
a new political system.
You started off.
And this political system has no leaders. It has people to talk.
Right now, listening to you today, I think if everyone speaking or everyone listening to you today would agree, words of wisdom, no?
Yeah.
He's either a bullshitter or not. It's either one way or the other.
There are many like him who we need to listen to. Can't start making leaders out of he's a good guy.
Well, are you going to lead rather than him?
I'm going to listen.
Yeah.
I did talk a bit about them. What I confessed at the beginning is that I need to do a lot more work on alternatives. Most of the work I've done over the last few years, apart from trying to earn a living and various other things, is on what's wrong with the system. I've started to look at solutions. That paper is well worth reading because I think it has some very good groundwork. But there are many ideas out there. Positive money I've seen, but I haven't studied. The New Economic Foundation is something I need to study. There are many alternatives. There's on these bits of paper, which if you like to pass around, there's a link to a book by a right-wing economist called Murray Rothbard, and he wrote something called The Mystery of Banking, which explains very clearly what I've been talking about in terms of the fractional reserve banking system and the role of the central banks. And he puts forward some ideas for an alternative banking system and monetary system. There is no ideal solution that is yet to form, And I think what we need to do as a populace is to educate ourselves on these matters and agree between us what is going to be in the interest of the majority. And what Margaret Kennedy says in that paper is that any system, the system that she's proposing, wouldn't just benefit the 99%, it will also benefit the 1%. And so everybody wins. So I'm very early in the process to answer your question, but that's my next job, if you like, apart from doing this.
Kind of just a quick question and point regarding that 99%. You're always mentioning that 99% we have to kind of educate ourselves in order to change the system, the monetary system like that. I mean, doesn't that mean that it undermines the system of the class system? That kind of idea. You just want to undermine that, or kind of, you know, to disregard to the wage slavery system. I believe of those things, which is it doesn't exist.
I think one of the problems with our system is that it shapes our thinking, irrespective of our political views. We think within the context of the paradigm that we know, and we have no experience of any other paradigm. If we move to a natural monetary system that grew very quickly until it reached the right stage and then leveled off, I believe that a new culture and a new thinking would emerge that wouldn't be class-based, because class-based, let's face it, comes down to money. In America, the class system is money-based. Yes, it's historical and aristocratic in this country, but that's the result of the money. So it's the money that is the root of this. So if we change the way we think about money, for example, if money costs you to hang on to it, you will want to use it productively in the economy. So and this is what happened many years ago. The Renaissance, as much as anything else, was a product of the money system. Because if you lodged your gold in a bank, you paid demurrage, typically 4 or 5%. So it made far more sense to use your money creatively in the economy, and that's why we ended up with beautiful buildings, and painters were paid to paint beautiful portraits. And the reason I feel such optimism is that if we could change the paradigm in which we live, there would be numerous benefits which are very difficult to predict at this time. Not only would it solve a lot of the problems that we talked about, but there would be additional benefits in terms of our feelings of community which have been destroyed. I mean, I believe technology is fantastic. I'm a techno freak, but I hate the idea of an iPhone because of what it represents in terms an iPhone, because of what it represents in terms of controlling people's content, for want of a better description. And Google's the same. That, you know, we all live in a compromise and we all have to use this stuff. But I could see a technological environment emerging where all of the discussions about IP rights and ownership and all the legal fees to prove ownership of this bit of IP and all that garbage which gets in the way of technology. The number of people who are involved in actually creating technology